So, Charlotte, what do you make of what Dominic Raab just said there? It's clear that he believes the threshold for bullying is just far too low, and that, in a way, a little bit of a stitch-up, one could say, almost.
I think there is a real question mark here as to whether the threshold is set appropriately. Now, obviously, the inquiry that's been done was based on the threshold, the description in the ministerial code. So the problem lies with the ministerial code. But in my view, I don't think that saying someone's work lacks the basics, you know, perhaps being a bit over-enthusiastic in your hand movements, criticising work. I don't think that does constitute bullying.
I mean, I had teachers who did worse than that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a one of the words in the report that we've had today says that he used the word woeful about some work. And I remember having a university tutor who told me in my first, based on my first essay, gosh, that really is terrible, isn't it? And I didn't feel he was bullying me. I mean, I think the idea, for me, bullying is something which is deliberate. It's something which is intentionally aimed at making someone feel inadequate, making someone kind of feel really deeply uncomfortable and attacked. And I think there's a big distinction between a pattern of behaviour with intent and someone who is, as he has described, very direct and very abrasive. I think the one caveat I would give is that I want to have ministers who can get the best out of the civil service. You know, I have worked for a Secretary of State. I worked for IDS as an advisor when he was...
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Sorry, Ian Duncan-Smith, exactly, when he was an advisor in the Department for Work and Pensions. And, you know, we had meetings where I would sit in there and think, this is fantastic, this is brilliant. I also had meetings where I thought, this is terrible, and how on earth are you going to send out a Secretary of State to make a case for this policy with the sort of quality of work? And so I think, you know, you need Secretary of States that get best out of people. You clearly don't want to have a consistent, abrasive behaviour. But the idea this is bullying, I think, is a bit of a stretch.
Paul, he talks about a tyranny of subjective hurt feelings. I think those were his words. Do you think that is fair comment?
Well, look, I'm a trade unionist to my core. I've represented people in the workplace who have suffered bullying, and we should all stand against it. I fear that actually the bar for bullying in this Adam Tolley report has been set so low that actually anything almost could constitute bullying. You know, somebody just being demanding, somebody just being assertive in a managerial role could constitute bullying. I mean, the definition includes things like being insulting. Well, let's be blunt. Which of us could say that we've never insulted somebody, even mildly, in the workplace in our time? And the problem is that by the definition of bullying within this report, that would make us all bullies. Now, I want cabinet ministers, I want elected politicians who are running big departments and running the country to be demanding. I want them to be assertive. Obviously, if they're overstepping the line and they are bullying people, then they need to be challenged. But I'm not sure, having read most of the report, I'm not sure what happened in this particular case could genuinely constitute bullying. So I think, there is a danger, and I think Raab has got a point on this, there is a danger that what we are seeing is a kind of emergent activist civil service, and I think that's something that should unite people across politics, whether you're Labour, whether you're Tory or something else, is that that's not the sort of thing you want to see. You don't want to see the tail wagging the dog. You want elected politicians to be running the country and making decisions, not civil servants.
Well, I want to get stuck into that, definitely, but let's just go over some of the allegations, because they do not sound, from what I'm reading anyway, they do not sound like they reach a threshold of bullying to warrant a forced resignation, essentially a sacking. He would raise his voice. He could be rude and aggressive. He engaged in hard staring, looking at people with cold fury. He expected them to have the answers to all of his questions. He would use hand gestures to indicate a person should be quiet. Charlotte, perhaps he was a little bit much on some occasions, a little bit rude, a little bit angry. But in a position as a Minister of State, as a Secretary of State, surely, if your civil servants aren't producing work that is up to scratch, isn't good enough, it's incumbent on him to lay down the law.
Yes, and there are ways of doing that. So I mentioned I was in the Department for Work and Pensions, in this instance, not in Duncan Smith, but another minister we had there. I can remember doing a meeting on quite a controversial policy that we wanted to do, and we probably had about 8 or 10 civil servants came in and started talking. Clear they didn't have the information we needed. Clear they hadn't even really tried to answer the questions. And the minister said, I'm ending this meeting. Come back when you have the information I need. That was a perfectly legitimate thing to say. Why go through wasting a minister's time if you haven't got the information that they need to make a decision? I think that the thing we need to be clear about is if you're consistently very aggressive, I'm not saying this is bullying at all. I think we have to be clear that there's, I think we've both said we think the threshold is too low to say, to make an accusation of bullying here. But again, an atmosphere where people feel very uncomfortable, or an atmosphere where there is kind of an abrasive character, you don't get the best from people if they're fearful. You don't get the best from teams if actually they're really nervous being in front of you.
I completely agree, and no one wants a boss who makes them fearful of coming into work, and that is too often the case. I'm sure all of us have experienced that at one point in our careers or another. But I think the point about ideological differences is a very real one. If we look at who's been accused of bullying in the government in terms of Conservative ministers, it has been Priti Patel, of course, who was trying to get through quite controversial policies that those working in the civil service may not have approved of, Paul. And now Dominic Raab, we know he had conservative views. And knowing civil servants myself, they are not naturally small c Conservatives, a lot of them. Do you think there's a case of civil servants acting against the wishes of ministers, trying to make it difficult for them?
Well, a former Labour MP, Chris Mullin, wrote a fantastic book called A Very British Coup in the early 1980s, and there was more than a kernel of truth, in my opinion, in terms of what he said. And he wrote about how an establishment conspired to prevent a radical Labour government led by a socialist Prime Minister from implementing its radical manifesto. I think that actually, whatever side of the political divide you are, the civil service like things done a certain way, and they become set in their ways. And if they have someone radical, whether it's from the left or whether it's from the right, then I sense that often they will go out of their way to try to resist those ideas being implemented and to try to stop them. I mean, yes, Minister wasn't a complete parody. I mean, anyone in politics will tell you that there was some truth in that as well. Tony Benn, in his diaries, famously wrote about how when he was appointed Secretary of State for Industry in 1974 on the back of a radical Labour manifesto, he was blocked every step of the way by the civil service. I mean, he and his permanent secretary, Sir Anthony Part, used to be at loggerheads with each other, where he tried to get the Radical Labour manifesto through, and Sir Anthony Part and officials within the department blocked him every step of the way. It's really worth reading the Benn diaries. Yeah. And I would say to colleagues on the left, before you jump on the anti-Raab bandwagon, look at the civil service, read the Benn diaries and see sometimes what you're up against.
I also saw that you suggested, where was the uproar from certain Labour MPs when it came to John Bercow's bullying allegations, which arguably were far worse on paper?
Oh, I think there's no question that was bullying. I mean, if you looked at what came out around that, I mean, it was horrendous. I don't think I personally wouldn't put Raab and Bercow in the same category. But, Paul's absolutely right. I mean, Tony Blair talked about the scars on my back from trying to overhaul the civil service. There was a piece in the news just this week or last week by Alan Milburn, former Labour Health Secretary, talking about how kind of obstructive at times the health department could be in trying to push through reforms, which I don't think you would argue were on the socialist left, but was certainly of it. So I think you're right, this is such a common story throughout. I think, at times, I'm not sure it's almost ideological or intentional on the part of civil servants. I think it is just this is how we do it and we're not going to change it.
Yes, I think it depends on the civil servant, but I do believe Raab when he says there could be some activism going on in the civil service. I mean, a lot of these people who work in the civil service are very political themselves, and that must come out in their conversations. Anyway, coming up, we're going to be talking to Jacob Rees-Mogg in just one moment, and we'll be getting your reaction too.